Yeah, I think I'm just going to use the body mic. All right, so good morning. My name is Andreas, and I will be presenting our paper entitled Enabling Lean Design with Management of Model Maturity on behalf of myself and my peers, Fredrik, Roar, and Ola. Now, traditional construction design management tend to resemble ad hoc approaches because of the fact that the design process is highly iterative and reciprocal, and that this nature of design is often found quite hard for managers to describe in terms which makes them approachable with sound approaches to planning and control. And the lack of planning and control in design often leads to constantly changing parameters for the design works, which makes it often for the designers to having to go back to rework their existing completed tasks. And what this does for the design process is that it often incentivizes the designers to delay their work because of the fact that the longer they wait before they start working, the more likely they are to pull relevant information from the other designers in terms of relevancy to the final construction. And what these management styles effectively does is that they fundamentally disincentivizes proactivity among designers, which is vitally important because of the fact that successful design is so reliant on having the designers working with each other and exchanging information between each other. So there have been a number of developments in the AEC industry over the last couple of decades, most notably in relation to design being that of building information management, or BIM, which has been driving information management in design, but industry sentiment and some studies still indicate that although we have these extended capabilities of using BIM, these new capabilities are still being managed with traditional mindsets. So the easy suggestion for us as researchers to make to managers who wants to plan and control their design process in an orderly fashion is to integrate or to use planning tools such as Last Planner, which has shown significant improvement in management practices when applied in construction phases, but has been found hard to integrate into design because of the fact that typical BIM workflows typically lack an orderly process of work. So, in other words, what this means is that trying to unlock the potential of using planning tools such as Last Planner in design would, in other words, be to find a sound approach to describe the iterative and reciprocal nature of design. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, a level of development, or LOD, has been identified as a potential solution for solving this issue, which some of you might recognize as an approach to formalize the development that happens within the BIM by specifying different levels of development that objects are progressing through as they develop. But although LOD has been approached in a lot of different ways, a lot of these approaches have been highly theoretical and emphasizing the hypothetical capabilities of LOD systems to the point which, in fact, that actual case implementations have shown a consistent lack of understanding in how LOD should be approached and implemented in projects. But recent development in the Norwegian AEC industry has seen the application of an LOD-based framework called Model Maturity Index, or MMI for short, the experiences of which remain relatively undocumented up until this point and serve as an interesting field of study for our, in relation to our problem. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to make sure to ensure that all of you are on the same page when I'm describing what I am talking about as maturity-based design management, which, for the purposes of this presentation, can most easily be described as the management of model development by approaching incomplete designs possessing important information, or in other words, partially complete designs, as specific deliveries in planning. And this is relevant because of the fact that Last Planner has a binary approach to task completion, meaning that a task has to be fully completed in reality for it to be described as completed in the plans. And this is a problem when approaching design because of the fact that from the development of an initial sketch towards the production-ready model, there happens a lot of interchanging pieces of information between models and designers, which is exactly the iterative and reciprocal nature of design that we are trying to find a way to describe, which maturity-based design management potentially solves by specifying different levels where the partially complete models possess important pieces of information that is relevant for other designers. So I reckon that most of you might be familiar with the concept LOD to a certain degree from before. The model maturity index might not be as familiar with, but in general terms, the model maturity framework are using more or less the same levels as LOD, with specifications more related to the process of in context of the process of the development of objects, and simplified with a lot simpler approach, which you can, it's perhaps a little bit hard to read on the slides here, but the sheer amount of words might prove my point. So, as I stated before, there have been a lot of research on the theoretical approaches of LOD, but in our opinion, the extended capabilities that we have from information technologies are only as relevant as the potential value you are enabled to create in projects when using them. So we rather took the approach of researching how maturity-based design management should be applied in projects in order to increase value. And we did this with the 3 research questions: what are the current approaches to maturity-based design management, what are the experiences from said approaches, and what are the recommendations for future implementations based on these experiences. Now, the study that we used in this study was a qualitative and empirical approach to assessing 2 case studies. But before we wanted to assess the case studies, we wanted to conduct a theoretical study in order to ensure that we were approaching the subject matter correctly in terms of the theory and understanding the correct context to which maturity-based design management fits in with existing theory. And in addition, this allowed us to formulate key aspects of the implementations of maturity-based design management, which served as an explanatory framework for assessing our cases and lastly, formulating recommendations according to each of these aspects. Now, what are these aspects? Well, the first aspect is pretty straightforward. Now, you had a set of increasing maturity levels, and thus you need a sound approach to specifying these levels. The second aspect is a little bit more complex. Now, up until this point, we've only been discussing the development of individual objects in the BIM, which many of you might know, construction projects can be quite large and include so many objects to the point at which keeping track of the maturity of all of these objects doesn't really benefit the manager in terms of sound approaches to planning and control, because of the fact that the sheer maturity of related information becomes incomprehensible to identify the relevant interdependencies between the designers that the managers are trying to manage, so to speak. So what is often done to solve this issue is to separate the model into different sections, which makes it easier for the managers to do so, but then you get the question of what the correct degree to which this should be done is. Now, the third aspect, as I mentioned before, it's vitally important in design that the designers are enabled to pull the information that they need from the partially completed designs of other designers. But in doing so, it's also very important that they are enabled to know the fitness of the information that he or she is working with. So what this means is that there needs to be a sound approach by management to communicate the current model maturity state to the designers as they are working. Fourth, there needs to be a sound approach to planning and controlling the workflow in relation to the previous aspects, that being the development that happens within the sections and as well as the overall development of sections. And lastly, there needs to be an authority on what the model maturity is, or in other words, there needs to be a responsible party for validating the maturity of deliveries. Now, the most observant of you might recognize the fact that the cases we have assessed here are quite different, one being an apartment complex in the middle of Oslo and the other being a road project in the middle of nowhere. But, and to say that these deviations in the projects or the variations in complexity and scope might make it impossible for us to draw specific conclusions. which actually were the case to a certain degree in one of these aspects, but largely weren't because of the fact that we are not approaching the specifics or the software side of these implementations, but rather trying to assess the cases on how they are describing the overall design development by use of by integration of model progression, and to use the MMI framework in this case as an interface between the two, which is just as relevant in residential projects as in infrastructure projects, as long as there is any sort of 3D modeling involved. Now, one important difference to note here is the fact that the infrastructure project was so large that it had so many designers that it had to separate the designers into different disciplinary teams, whereas in the residential project, all of these designers were managed on one design team, making up multiple disciplines. So, as many of you might not be able to see because the text is so small, the maturity approaches in both of these cases emphasized simplicity and was quite similar, in fact, in almost all of the aspects except for the approach to communicating the state of the model maturity. But in other words, they were quite similar in the fact that they both use functional requirements for maturity deliveries rather than geometrical requirements, and that they both used the maturity as an indicator of disciplinary models within large sections of the BIM. So in other words, they separated the models into different sections and managed the maturity as an indicator of the disciplinary models within each of these sections. So it's important to note when we are discussing the experiences from these cases that the experiences that I am presenting here today are the subjective assessments made by the designers themselves, meaning that they are by no means any quantitative or definitive measures of success. But we managed to draw a couple of conclusions from the responses. First of all, the fact that when compared to traditional approaches of not using any maturity-based design approaches, the experiences of using the MMI framework were exclusively positive, citing a number of benefits such as an increased understanding of current model states and overall project progress, in addition to an increased ability to share incomplete information. Now, in relation to the latter, one designer made an interesting point when describing the MMI framework as a language for the designers to use between each other, making a case for maturity-based design management not only as a means to plan and control BIM-based workflows, which has been more or less the approach that we have been taking so far in the study, but also as a communication tool for the designers to use between each other, which leads to a more distributed understanding of model progression among the entirety of the design team, which can be argued is a lot better and leaner solution than traditional approaches where the designer or the BIM coordinator knows all the interdependencies and having the designers work in the dark. So in addition to this, what was also observed was the fact that the system was voluntarily adopted by all of the designers, indicating successful implementation because of the fact that the designers rather didn't revert to their traditional practices. Now, as I mentioned before, the approaches to communicate model state differed quite significantly. And what you are seeing here on your right, or probably not seeing, I'm sorry for that, are the approach taken in the residential project where on a weekly basis the number of collisions in model was charted based both by discipline to the right, to the left, and between disciplines to the right. And why this is relevant was because of the fact that the MMI levels 300 and 350 had the requirement of having no relevant collisions either within the specific discipline for the MMI 300 level or between disciplines for the MMI 350 level. So the number of collisions in these graphs are the total number of collisions in a model, meaning that they include a lot of collisions that might have no relevance to constructability. But because of the fact that the relevant MMI deliveries here are relating to having no relevant collisions, we should at least be able to observe a significantly declining trend towards these maturity deliveries if the model progression was committed as it should, which we did not see during the design of the first building at all. In fact, it spikes up on the interdisciplinary side, But just 4 months later, during the design of the third building, we see exactly the pattern that we're looking for, with a significantly declining trend in the amount of clashes just in time for the models to mature. The two sections here obviously are comparable in terms of complexity and size. So this pattern that you are seeing on the bottom here subsided for the succeeding 6 sections for this project, indicating that the designers, although they needed some time to grew accustomed to the system and weren't successful in meeting deadlines initially, managed to grow in their predictability in planning later on. And none of the MMI deliveries for the later stages were moved from the initial planning at the start of the project. So this obviously indicates that they were successful in their approaches. Now, infrastructure projects, on the other hand, are a lot less dependent on small geometrical tolerances than building projects. And in addition, the project that we are assessing here had multiple design teams working on multiple sections at a time, and had a construction team standing by on the site, eager to jump on any opportunity to start producing. So, as you can tell, the approach here is a lot more simple and trying to communicate the entirety of the model state, both by section, as you can see on the horizontal axis, and by discipline, as you can see on the vertical axis. And doing so in a manner which was easy to understand for external stakeholders. Now, during our research, we weren't able to find any indication that any of the designers had any trouble to understand the current model state, which makes it hard for us to make a specific recommendation on this point, other than the fact that we observed that both of these approaches are highly visual, emphasizing on our intuitive understanding as human beings of shapes and colors, but also the fact that project flexibility in approaches are apparently very important in order to achieve a successful adoption. Now, what was also considered a success in these cases was the management of maturity for disciplinary models within large sections. And this was, the reasons for this were really twofold, as you can see examples here from the residential project and the road project. The reasons for this being a success were, first of all, that the management of maturity by disciplinary models meant that for the designers it was a lot easier to identify the relevant interfaces between the different disciplinary models, which in other terms are the interdependencies that the managers need to plan and control for. But also the management of larger sections was generally favored by management because of the fact that it enabled them to more easily describe the overall project development. And all of them stated that having managed maturity on an object level would have made this almost impossible for them to do. So not all of the approaches were considered successful, however, and the functional requirements of maturity levels were, because of the fact that instead of the approaches taking the geometrical requirements, where you're really pushing more work on the designers for what they should do, the approach to specifying functional requirements for maturity levels rather associates the existing work that the designers had always been doing to the context of overall project development. So these levels were formulated in quite simple terms, as I mentioned before, and this was perceived to be making adoption easier. But a side effect of this was the fact that the levels lacked specificity, and that the designers, in many cases, at least early on, had to make subjective assessment as to what they were supposed to deliver, which obviously isn't great when you're dealing with 10 different interpretations of what one maturity delivery should be. So the solution to this, as presented by us and generally favored by the interview participants, would be to keep the functional requirements of maturity deliveries and the simpler approaches to them, but to specify these levels using binary completion statements, such as checklists, making it easier for the designers to know exactly what constitutes a maturity level and what does not. So, as a side effect of the fact that many designers were found to deliver maturity deliveries that didn't live up to their intended maturity, this also did prove that some sort of third-party validation was necessary in these projects, in the form of, let's say, owners during the early MMI levels, that being the concept development, BIM coordinators during the detailing, and or production personnel when the models started to be ready for production. So all of these experiences and theory leads us to the recommendations for management to use in maturity-based design management in their practices. Now, it's important to note that we didn't want to make any suggestions that might have negative consequences for adoption of these practices, which meant that the recommendations you are looking at here are serves more or less as a one-size-fits-all alternative for new adoption, and that there might be a lot of approaches that might be a lot more value-creating in actual projects. But we couldn't really make it any more specified than this in order to not be giving any negative effects. But what we argue is that in order to ensure successful adoption, there should still be knowledge among the management team of all of these specific aspects as to how to successfully and preemptively formulate approaches according to each of these aspects in order to ensure a successful adoption of these practices. Indicating that perhaps as a result of our study, it's not necessarily the specific recommendations that we are making that is important to take away with from this, but more the actual aspects that we formulated from the theory. So other general tips or fun points that we were able to make from these implementations was the fact that both of these implementations were emphasizing simplicity, which seemed as a vital, important piece of adoption of new practices. Maybe primarily because of the fact that these approaches are, it's easier to make people do something when you require less of them, but also due to the fact that these approaches can serve as foundations for standardization and continuous improvement. The combination of the two effectively means that when trying to adopt these new practices, you are enable the managers and the designers to learn to walk before they are able to run, so to speak, which one can make the argument that really complicated implementation approaches might be more like running in this metaphor. So this standardization should not come at the cost of flexibility, however, which was proved to be important in adoption of both of these cases, leading us to suggest that companies should strive for standardization and continuous improvement of their management functionality, but to exercise flexibility in choosing what functionality to employ in different projects. So that is all fine, but the final point that I want you to take away with from my presentation here is that, in our opinion, according to the theory, the purpose of maturity-based management systems such as LOD or MMI is to describe BIM workflows in ways which makes them compatible with sound approaches to planning and control, which at the end of the day is really every manager's goal in any type of project. And that it's perhaps easy for especially BIM coordinators to fall in love with very complicated LOD specifications without consulting what the designers actually need to improve their progress. And what that effectively is pushing a lot of needless capabilities on projects and creating more work rather than taking simple steps to associating existing work to overall project development, which is what we are advocating for in this paper. So that concludes my presentation. Special acknowledgements go out to Håkon Fløysbond and Gunnar Skeie, being the authors of the MMI framework, in addition to management in Skanska Norway and Veidekke Entreprenør, especially into you participants for making the study possible. That was all I had for you today. Thank you.